What would you do if a wild animal, barely old enough to survive on its own, approached you not with fear, but with desperate hope? What if this creature, driven by an instinct deeper than survival itself, seemed to be pleading for your help? This is the extraordinary true story of David Mitchell, a forest ranger from British Columbia whose ordinary Tuesday morning became a life-changing encounter that would capture hearts around the world and remind us all of the profound connections that exist between humans and the natural world. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to catch more heartwarming stories like this one. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. It was early September 2023, and the Canadian wilderness was painted in the first whispers of autumn. The morning mist clung to the towering pine trees like ghostly fingers, and the air carried that crisp promise of the changing season. David Mitchell, a seasoned forest ranger with over 15 years of experience patrolling the remote forests of British Columbia, was making his usual rounds along Highway 37, a lonely stretch of road that cuts through some of the most pristine wilderness in North America. David had seen it all in his years as a ranger: countless wildlife encounters, rescue operations, and the endless dance between civilization and the untamed wild. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what he was about to witness on that misty Tuesday morning. As his ranger vehicle rounded a familiar bend, something unusual caught his eye. There, sitting in the middle of the asphalt road, was a small brown figure. At first glance, David thought it might be a large dog that had wandered away from a nearby campsite. But as he slowed his vehicle and looked closer, his heart nearly stopped. It was a bear cub. Not just any bear cub, but one that couldn't have been more than 4 months old. Its fur was a rich, chocolate brown, still fluffy with that baby softness that made it look more like a living teddy bear than a wild predator. The cub was sitting upright, almost human-like, in the center of the yellow dividing line, and what David saw next sent chills down his spine. The cub wasn't running away, as any normal wild animal would. Instead, it was looking directly at him, and in those dark, intelligent eyes, David saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: pure, desperate pleading. David slowly pulled his vehicle to a stop, about 30 feet from the cub, his mind racing through his training. Bears, even cubs, were dangerous. Mother bears were notoriously protective, and approaching a cub could mean signing your own death warrant. But something about this situation felt different. Terribly, heartbreakingly different. The cub didn't move. It just sat there, watching him with those impossibly expressive eyes. David had worked with wildlife for years, and he'd learned to read the subtle language of animals. This wasn't aggression. This wasn't fear. This was communication. David stepped out of his vehicle slowly, every sense on high alert, scanning the tree line for any sign of an angry mother bear. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds singing, no rustle of leaves, no sound of approaching danger. Just him, the cub, and a silence so profound it felt like the entire wilderness was holding its breath. "Hey there, little one," David whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle morning breeze. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The cub's response was unlike anything David had ever experienced in his career. Instead of running, the small creature stood up on its hind legs, a behavior that in adult bears would be threatening, but in this tiny cub looked almost human. Then, in a moment that would be seared into David's memory forever, the cub began to walk toward him. Not run, not charge. Walk. Each step was deliberate, purposeful, and with each small paw that touched the asphalt, David felt his understanding of wildlife behavior being completely rewritten. The cub approached to within 10 feet of him and stopped, sitting back down and looking up at David with those pleading eyes. And then the most extraordinary thing happened. The cub turned around and began walking back the way he had come, but after just a few steps, It stopped and looked back at David, as if to say, "Follow me." David's training told him to call for backup, to maintain safe distance, to follow protocol, but his heart told him something very different. This wasn't a random encounter. This cub was trying to tell him something, and every fiber of his being screamed that time was of the essence. Against everything he'd been taught, David began to follow the cub. The small bear led him off the road and into the dense forest, moving with surprising confidence for such a young animal. Every few yards, the cub would pause and look back, making sure David was still following. It was behavior that defied everything scientists knew about bear cubs, behavior that suggested a level of intelligence and desperation that most people would find impossible to believe. As they moved deeper into the forest, David began to notice signs of disturbance. Broken branches, disturbed earth, and then his blood ran cold. Tire tracks. Deep, heavy tire tracks that had no business being this far into protected wilderness. The cub's pace quickened, and David could hear something that made his heart race. The sound of distressed animal calls in the distance. Deep, mournful sounds that could only be coming from an adult bear in serious trouble. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, the cub led David into a small clearing, and what he saw there would change his life forever. In the center of the clearing was a sight that brought tears to David's eyes and rage to his heart. A massive female black bear, probably weighing close to 300 pounds, was trapped in the most cruel and inhumane way imaginable. Poachers. They had set up an illegal snare trap, the kind designed not just to capture, but to cause maximum suffering. The heavy steel cable was wrapped tightly around mother bear's hind leg, attached to a tree with a mechanism that tightened every time she struggled. The more she fought to free herself, the deeper the cable cut into her flesh. But this wasn't a recent capture. From the condition of the surrounding area, the trampled earth, the scattered food remnants, David could tell that this magnificent creature had been trapped here for at least 2 days, possibly 3. She was severely dehydrated, exhausted, and weak from her constant struggle for freedom. The mother bear looked up as David and her cub entered the clearing, and in that moment, David witnessed something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about animal intelligence and emotion. The massive bear stopped struggling and made a sound, a gentle, almost conversational grunt that seemed directed not at David, but to her cub. The little cub responded immediately, running to his mother and nuzzling against her massive head. The tender reunion lasted only a moment before the cub turned back to David, and once again, those dark eyes seemed to communicate a message as clear as spoken words. "Please help her." David later described that moment as the most profound interspecies communication he'd ever experienced. He said, "It was like the cub was speaking to me, not with words, but with something deeper than words. Pure emotion, pure need, pure trust." David immediately radioed for emergency wildlife rescue, but he knew that help was at least an hour away, maybe more given their remote location. The mother bear was in bad shape. Her breathing was labored, her eyes were dull with pain and exhaustion, and the wound where the snare cut into her leg was severe. He had 2 choices: wait for help and risk losing the mother bear, or take action himself and risk his own life. The decision was made for him when the mother bear suddenly collapsed. The cub immediately began crying, and there's no other word for it. The sound that came from that small creature was heartbreaking, a keening wail of distress that echoed through the forest. David had never heard anything like it, and he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't just stand by and watch. David approached slowly, talking in soft, reassuring tones to both bears. The mother was barely conscious, but she watched him with wary eyes as he examined the snare. What he found made him sick to his stomach. The trap was designed with a ratcheting mechanism that made it impossible for the animal to escape on its own. Worse, it was equipped with barbs that dug deeper into flesh with every movement. This wasn't just poaching, this was torture. But David had something the poachers hadn't counted on. 15 years of wilderness survival training and a toolkit designed for exactly these kinds of emergencies. Working as carefully and quickly as possible, David began the delicate process of freeing the mother bear. The cubs stayed close, sometimes nuzzling against David's arm as he worked, as if encouraging him or showing gratitude for his efforts. The most dangerous moment came when David had to cut through the main cable. He needed to get close to the mother bear's powerful jaws and claws, and despite her weakened state, she was still a 300-pound predator with the strength to kill him with a single swipe. But something magical happened in that clearing. As David worked to free her, the mother bear seemed to understand that he was helping. She remained completely still, even when the cutting tool made contact with her injured leg, even when David had to manipulate the painful snare to remove it. The cub, meanwhile, positioned itself between David and its mother's head, almost as if it was serving as a translator, communicating David's peaceful intentions to its mother through touch and soft bear vocalizations. After nearly 30 minutes of painstaking work, David heard the most beautiful sound in the world: the metallic snap of the cable breaking free. The mother bear was free. What happened next was something that David says he'll remember for the rest of his life. The mother bear, despite her pain and exhaustion, slowly raised her massive head and looked directly at David. For a long moment, human and bear regarded each other in complete silence. Then, in a gesture that defied all scientific understanding of bear behavior, she slowly extended her enormous paw toward David, not in aggression, not in threat, but in what could only be described as gratitude. David, tears streaming down his face, gently reached out and briefly touched that massive paw with his fingertips. It was a moment of connection that transcended species, an acknowledgement between two intelligent beings who had shared something profound. The cub, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, approached David and did something that would melt the hearts of millions when the story was later shared. It gently rubbed against David's leg, much like a domestic cat might do, before rejoining its mother. By the time the wildlife rescue team arrived, they found David sitting quietly on a fallen log, watching from a respectful distance as the mother bear slowly regained her strength with her cub close by her side. The veterinary team that accompanied the rescue was amazed, not just by the condition of the bears, but by the scene they encountered. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead wildlife veterinarian who treated the mother bear, later said, "In all my years of wildlife rescue, I've never seen anything like it. The trust these animals showed toward David was extraordinary. It was like they understood he was there to help." The story doesn't end with the rescue. David's discovery of the illegal snare led to a major investigation into poaching activities in the region. The tire tracks he'd noticed led authorities to a well-organized poaching ring that had been operating in the area for months. Within 2 weeks, 3 men were arrested and charged with multiple wildlife crimes. The evidence David gathered at the scene, photographs, GPS coordinates, and even samples of the illegal snare, was crucial in securing convictions that would put these poachers behind bars for years. But perhaps more importantly, David's story sparked a conversation about the intelligence and emotional capacity of wild animals. The viral video of the cub asking for help challenged people's assumptions about animal consciousness and the deep bonds that exist in the natural world. Dr. Chen and her team were able to provide immediate medical care to the mother bear at the rescue site. The wound on her leg was serious but not life-threatening, and her overall condition, while concerning, was stable. The decision was made to relocate both bears to a temporary wildlife rehabilitation facility where the mother could recover fully before being returned to the wild. Throughout her recovery, the cub never left her side, providing what Dr. Chen described as the best possible medicine: love and companionship. David visited the bears several times during their recovery, and each time both animals showed clear recognition of their human rescuer. The cub would approach the fence of their enclosure and sit quietly whenever David appeared, while the mother bear would watch him with what could only be described as gentle acknowledgement. "It's like they remember," David said during one of his visits. "Not just that I helped them, but the whole experience we shared together." After 6 weeks of recovery, both bears were declared ready for release back into the wild. The release site was carefully chosen, far from roads, far from human activity, and in an area with abundant food sources as winter approached. David was invited to be present for the release, and what happened that day provided the perfect conclusion to this extraordinary story. When the transport cages were opened, the mother bear emerged first, immediately scanning the area for any signs of danger. The cub bounded out after her, full of energy and clearly excited to be back in its natural environment. But before disappearing into the forest, both bears turned back toward the humans who had gathered to witness their release. The cub sat up on its hind legs one final time, the same position David had first seen it in that misty morning road, and the mother bear stood behind it, as if posing for a final photograph. Then, as quickly as they had appeared in David's life, they melted back into the wilderness, leaving behind only paw prints in the soft earth and memories that would last a lifetime. The story of David and the bears didn't end with their release. News of the rescue spread around the world, shared millions of times on social media, and featured in documentaries about animal intelligence and human-wildlife relationships. But perhaps most importantly, it sparked real change. The poaching investigation led to stricter enforcement of wildlife protection laws in British Columbia. New penalties were established for illegal trapping, and additional funding was allocated for ranger patrols in remote wilderness areas. David became an advocate for wildlife protection, speaking at schools and conservation events about the intelligence and emotional capacity of wild animals. He established the Bear Cub Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing wildlife poaching and supporting the rehabilitation of injured wild animals. That little cub taught me something I never learned in all my years of ranger training, David often tells audiences. Animals don't just think and feel, they hope, they trust, they love, and sometimes they know exactly when to ask for help. Dr. Jane Morrison, a wildlife behaviorist at the University of British Columbia who studied video footage of the rescue, provided scientific context for the extraordinary behavior David witnessed.
What we see in this case challenges traditional understanding of animal cognition, Dr. Morrison explained. The cub's behavior suggests not just intelligence, but metacognition, the ability to think about thinking. The cub somehow understood that David was a potential source of help and developed a strategy to communicate that need. The case has been studied extensively and is now cited in animal behavior textbooks as an example of interspecies communication and problem-solving behavior in wild animals. David's experience offers profound lessons about our relationship with the natural world. The first lesson is about listening. We spend so much time trying to control nature that we forget to listen to what it's trying to tell us, David reflects. That cub was communicating as clearly as any human could. I just had to be open to hearing it. The second lesson is about trust. The mutual trust displayed between David and the bears, a human trusting wild predators, wild animals trusting a human, demonstrates the possibility of peaceful coexistence when we approach wildlife with respect and understanding. The third lesson is about taking action. David could have called for backup and waited safely in his vehicle. Instead, he chose to follow his instincts and take personal risk to help creatures in need. That decision saved 2 lives and inspired millions. A year after the rescue, David was conducting his regular patrol along the same stretch of Highway 37 when something remarkable happened. As he rounded the familiar bend where he first encountered the cub, he saw 2 bears foraging in a meadow visible from the road. One was a large female. The other was a young bear, no longer a cub, but not yet fully grown. David stopped his vehicle and watched through binoculars as the 2 bears went about their daily routine of searching for food and preparing for the coming winter. He couldn't be certain they were the same bears he had rescued. Black bears can look very similar, and the wilderness holds many such families. But as he watched, the younger bear suddenly stopped its foraging and looked directly at David's vehicle. Even from that distance, even through binoculars, David felt a moment of recognition, a brief acknowledgement between old friends. The young bear sat up on its hind legs, held that position for a long moment, then dropped back down and continued foraging with its mother. David chose to believe it was them, and whether it was or not, the message was clear. The wilderness continues, the circle of life goes on, and sometimes, just sometimes, humans and animals can be partners in that beautiful, ongoing story. The story of David Mitchell and the bear family reminds us that we share this planet with creatures of remarkable intelligence, deep emotion, and surprising capacity for trust. It challenges us to see beyond our own species and recognize the profound connections that exist throughout the natural world. But this story also reminds us that those connections are fragile. Every day, wildlife faces threats from poaching, habitat destruction, and human encroachment. Every day, we have the opportunity to choose protection over exploitation, conservation over consumption, and understanding over fear. David's experience shows us that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply pay attention. Listen to what the natural world is trying to tell us. Be open to the unexpected, and when called upon, have the courage to act. The mother bear and her cub are thriving somewhere in the vast wilderness of British Columbia, living proof that compassion can triumph over cruelty, that understanding can bridge any gap, even the one between species, and that sometimes the most profound conversations happen without a single word being spoken. If this story moved you, there are ways you can help wildlife in your own community. Support local wildlife rehabilitation centers. Report suspicious activities that might harm animals. Choose products and practices that protect rather than exploit natural habitats. And most importantly, teach the next generation that we are not separate from nature. We are part of it. Every subscription to channels that share these stories helps spread awareness. Every like, every share, every comment adds to the conversation about protecting the incredible creatures we share this world with. and every person who hears this story becomes a potential guardian of the wild. Because somewhere out there, on a misty morning, another animal might need a hero. And that hero could be you. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of human and animal connection. Like this video if it touched your heart, and hit that notification bell so you never miss these amazing tales of hope, courage, and the unbreakable bonds that connect all living things. Until next time, remember, in a world where you can be anything, choose to be the person an animal would trust with their life.